Our guest today is an historian and poet, a scholar whose artistry is directed towards revealing truth as an author and educator, a translator of poetry, a former diplomat, an investigative writer of political prose, Professor Emeritus of English at the University of California, Berkeley, a lover of words, and the originator of the term deep politics. It's an honor to introduce Professor Peter Dale Scott. Thank you for being with us.
Yes, well, I wish I could be with you more, but I'll do the best I can. My talk today is on Dallas and other deep events, and I have been analyzing American history in the light of what I have called structural deep events. Events like the JFK assassination, the Watergate break-in, Iran-Contra, or 9/11. Which repeatedly involve law-breaking or violence, are mysterious to begin with, are embedded in ongoing covert processes, have political consequences that enlarge covert government, and are subsequently covered up by systematic falsifications in the mainstream media and internal government records. The more I study these deep events, the more I see suggestive similarities between them, increasing the possibility that they are not unrelated external intrusions on American history, but parts of an endemic process, sharing, to some degree or other, a common source. There we go. The more I study these deep, for example, one factor linking Dallas-Watergate, Iran-Contra, and 9/11 has been the involvement in all four deep events of personnel involved in America's highest level emergency planning, known since the 1950s as continuity of government, COG planning, or more colloquially inside the Pentagon as the Doomsday Project. A few may have been located at the top as overseers of the secret COG system. Others, including some I shall talk about today, were located further down in its secret communications network. I see this planning group as one among many in what I have chosen to call the American deep state, along with agencies like the CIA and NSA, the private groups like Booz Allen Hamilton, to which more than half of the US intelligence budget is now outsourced, and finally, the powerful banks and corporations whose views are well represented in the CIA and NSA. But if only one group among many, the COG planning group is also special because of its control of and access to a communications channel not under government control that can reach deeply into the US social structure. I discuss these matters at some length in my next book, The American Deep State, due out in November. COG planning was originally authorized by Truman and Eisenhower as planning for a response to a crippling atomic attack that had decapitated government. In consequence, its planning group contemplated extreme measures, including what Alfonso Ciardi in 1987 called, quote, suspension of the Constitution, close quote. And yet, in Iran-Contra, its asset of the secret communications network developed for the catastrophe of decapitation was used instead to evade an official embargo on arms sales to Iran. My question today is whether the network could have been similarly misused in November 1963. The Iran-Contra misuse has been well documented. Oliver North supervised the sale of arms to Iran by using his resources as the National Security Council Action Officer for COG planning under cover of a, quote, National Program Office, close quote, that was overseen by then Vice President George H.W. Bush. North and his superiors could thus use the COG emergency network, known then as Flashboard, for the arms sales to Iran that had to be concealed from other parts of the Washington bureaucracy. So when North had to send emergency instructions to the U.S. Embassy in Lisbon, instructions that violated government policy, he used the Flashboard network to avoid alerting the ambassador and other unwitting personnel. The documented example of Iran-Contra allows me to explain what I am saying about the users of the COG network and also what I am not saying. To begin with, I am not saying that a single secret team has for decades been using the COG network to manipulate the US government outside it. There is no evidence to suggest that North's actions in Iran-Contra were known to any of his superiors other than then CIA Chief William Casey and probably George Bush. The point is that a very small group had access to a very high-level secret network outside government view in order to implement an anti-government policy. They succumbed to the temptation to use this secure network that had been designed for other purposes, and almost certainly this network was used again on 9/11, although whether for illicit or illicit purposes is not known. It is certain that the COG emergency network program survived North's demise and continued to be secretly developed for decades at a cost of billions and overseen by a team including Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. It is relevant that the two men's presence on the committee spanned 3 administrations, those of Reagan, Bush 1, and Clinton, even though at one point neither man held a position inside the US government. Such continuity was essential for a group so secret that few records existed of its responsibilities. And on 9/11, COG plans were officially activated for the very first time by Cheney and Rumsfeld, the two men who had planned them for so many years. Whether or not they knew about Iran-Contra, Cheney and Rumsfeld were on the COG planning at the time of Iran-Contra. There is no such obvious link between COG planning and Watergate, but the involvement of COG personnel in Watergate is nonetheless striking. James McCord, one of the chief Watergate workers, was a member of a small Air Force Reserve unit in Washington attached to the Office of Emergency Preparedness, OEP, that was assigned to draw up lists of radicals and to develop contingency plans for censorship of the news media and U.S. mail in time of war, close quote. His unit was part of the Wartime Information Security Program, WISP, which had responsibility for activating, quote, contingency plans for imposing censorship on the press, the mails, and all telecommunications, including government communications, and preventive detention of civilian security risks who would be placed in military camps, close quote. In addition, John Dean, perhaps the central Watergate figure, had overseen secret COG activities when serving as the Associate Deputy Attorney General. In the case of the JFK assassination, I wish to focus on 2 men who functioned as part of the communications network of the Office of Emergency Planning, OEP, the agency renamed in 1968 as the Office of Emergency Preparedness, to which McCord was attached, and then renamed again in 1982 as the National Program Office, for which Oliver North was the action officer. These two men, there are others, are Winston Lawson, the Secret Service advance man who, from the lead car of the motorcade, was in charge of the Secret Service radio channels operating in the motorcade, and Jack Crichton, the Army Intelligence Reserve officer, who, with Deputy Dallas Police Chief George Lumpkin, selected the Russian interpreter for Marina Oswald's first FBI interview, which was a falsified interview. Lawson has drawn the critical attention of JFK researchers, both for very dubious actions he took before and during the assassination, and also for false statements he made after, some of them under oath. For example, it was Lawson who shortly before November 22nd altered the planned motorcade route to include the fatal dogleg turn on Houston and Elm that led the president past the Texas School Book Depository, and questioned by the Warren Commission staff why he didn't simply have the motorcade continue down Main Street through the railway underpass. Lawson replied, quote, "Because it is my understanding there isn't any entrance to the freeway on Main Street," close quote. This claim was false, and almost certainly Lawson knew it. As Michael Calder has written, he, quote, had already driven over the original direct Main Street route, not once, but twice, prior to the president's arrival, close quote. Early on November 22nd, at Love Field, Lawson installed in what would become the lead car, the base radio, whose frequencies were used by all Secret Service agents on the motorcade. This radio channel was operated by the White House Communications Agency, WHCA, and it was used for some key decisions before and after the assassination. Yet its records, unlike those of the Dallas Police Department DPD channels 1 and 2, the WHCA records were never made available to the Warren Commission or any subsequent investigation. The tapes were not withheld because they were relevant. On the contrary, they contained very significant information. The WHCA actually reports to this day on its website that the agency was, in their words, quote, a key player in documenting the assassination of President Kennedy, close quote. However, it is not clear when this documentation was conducted or why it was not made available to the Warren Commission, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, or the Assassination Records Review Board. It should have been. For one thing, the WHCA tape, as Vincent Calamara has written, contains the key to the unresolved mystery of who, after the shooting, redirected the motorcade to Parkland Hospital. The significance of this apparently straightforward command, about which there was much conflicting testimony, is heightened when we realize that the decision to go to Parkland had been predetermined before the assassination. Dallas motorcycle policemen had already cleared a path to Parkland in response to orders issued shortly before the shooting, and you can hear them on the police channel tapes, orders not to deal with the soon-to-be wounded president, but to clear a path for an ambulance carrying somebody in front of the Texas School Book Depository who was wrongly suspected of having suffered epileptic seizure. The WHCA radio channel used by Lawson and others communicated almost directly to the WHCA base at Mount Weather, Virginia, the base facility of the COG network. From there, Secret Service communications were relayed to the White House via the, and this is another quote, batteries of communications equipment connecting Mount Weather with the White House and, quote, Raven Rock, the underground Pentagon 60 miles north of Washington, as well as with almost every U.S. military unit stationed around the globe, close quote. Jack Crichton, head of the 488th Army Intelligence Reserve Unit of Dallas, was also part of this Mount Weather COG network. This was in his capacity as Chief of Intelligence for Dallas Civil Defense, which worked out of an underground emergency operating center. As Russ Baker reports, because it was intended for continuity of government operations during an attack, the center was fully equipped with communications equipment. Now, in retrospect, the Civil Defense Program is remembered derisively for having advised school children in the event of an atomic attack to hide their heads under their desks. But in 1963, civil defense was one of the urgent responsibilities assigned to the Office of Emergency Planning, which is why Crichton, as much as Secret Service agent Lawson, could be in direct touch with the OEB's Emergency Communications Network at Mount Weather. Jack Crichton is of interest because he, along with DPD Deputy Chief Lumpkin of the 488th Army Intelligence Reserve Unit, was responsible for choosing a Russian interpreter for Marina Oswald from the right-wing Russian community. This man was Ilya Mamantov, who translated for Marina at her first DPD interview on November 22nd. What she allegedly said in Russian at this interview was later used to bolster what I have called the Phase 1 story, still promoted from some CIA sources, that Russia and or Cuba behind the assassination. As summarized by the FBI, Mamantov's account of Marina's Russian testimony was as follows, and this is from the FBI account in the Warren Commission records. Marina Oswald advised that Lee Harvey Oswald owned a rifle which he used in Russia about 2 years ago. She observed what she presumed to be the same rifle in a blanket in the garage at Ruth Kane's residence. Marina Oswald stated that on November 22nd, she had been shown a rifle in the Dallas Police Department. She stated that it was a dark color like the one she had seen, but she did not recall the sight. Now, these specific details that Marina said she had seen a rifle that was dark and scopeless were confirmed in an affidavit signed by Marina and Mamantov that was taken by DPD officer B.L. Senkel. They were confirmed again by Ruth Payne, who witnessed the Mamantov interview. They were confirmed again the next night in an interview with Marina by the Secret Service, translated by Mamantov's close friend Peter Gregory. But the Secret Service transcript of the interview reveals that the source of these details was Gregory and not Marina. So listen carefully. This is from one of the Secret Service records in the Dallas, the Warren Commission documents. It's number 344. It's a long quote, bear with. Question: this gun, is it a rifle or a pistol or just what kind of gun? Can she answer that? Answer: it was a good gun. Mr. Gregory asked, can you describe it? Note: subject said, I cannot describe it because a rifle to be like all rifles. And the Gregory translation, she said she cannot describe it. It was sort of a dark rifle, just like any other common rifle. Subject in Russian, it was a hump or elevation, but I never saw through the scope. Gregory's translation, she says there was an elevation on the rifle, but there was no scope, no telescope. End of the long quote from the transcript. We have to conclude not just that Gregory had falsified Rita's testimony, she had said a rifle to be like all rifles, so probably had his friend Mamantov, who later testified no less than 7 times to the Warren Commission that Marina had used the word dark to describe the gun. There were others in Dallas who claimed that Oswald's gun indeed had been scopeless until Oswald had a scope installed on it by Dallas gunsmith Dio Ryder. The Warren court elaborately refuted this corroborated claim and concluded that, quote, the authenticity of the repair tag, quote, used to support it was, quote, subject to grave doubts. That's the Warren report on page 317. We can see here what the Warren Commission did not wish to see, signs of a conspiracy to misrepresent Marina's testimony and possibly to link Oswald's gun to a dark and scopeless rifle he had used in the Soviet Union. Our concerns that Mamantov misrepresented her lead us to concerns why 2 Army Intelligence Reserve officers from 488th Unit, Jack Brighton, and Deputy DPD Chief George Lumpkin, selected Mamantov as her interpreter. Our concerns are increased when we see that D.L. Senkel, the DPD officer who took Marina's suspect affidavit, was the partner of F.P. Turner, who collected the dubious rifle repair tag, and that both men spent most of November 22nd with DPD Deputy Chief Lumpkin. For example, they were with Lumpkin in the pilot car of motorcade when Lumpkin was communicating with Winston Lawson in the lead car behind them. I conclude that when we look at the context of the 2 men we know to have been parts of the COG Emergency Communications Network in Dallas, we see patterns of sinister behavior that also involve others, or what we may call conspiratorial behavior. These concatenated efforts to implicate Oswald in a Phase 1 conspiracy narrative lead me to propose a hypothesis for which I have neither evidence nor an alternative explanation, namely that someone on the WHCA network may have been the source for the important unexplained description on the Dallas police tapes of a suspect who looked upon us, who had exactly the same false height and weight, 5 feet 10 inches, 165 pounds, recorded for Oswald in his FBI and CIA files. Note that there are no other known sources describing the specific height and weight to Oswald. For example, when he was arrested and charged in Dallas that same day, Oswald was having a height, recorded as having a height of 5 foot 9.5 inches and a height of 131 pounds. I've collected many such records. The usual weight given for him is 104 pounds. The first reference to Oswald was 5 foot 10 inches, 165 pounds, was that offered by Oswald's mother, Marguerite, to FBI agent Fain in May 1960, when Oswald himself was absent in Russia. The DPD officer contributing description on the police channel was Inspector Herbert Sawyer, who allegedly had heard it from someone outside the Texas School Book Depository, whom he could not identify or describe. The warrant report said categorically that his source was Howard Brennan, and that on the evening of November 22nd, Brennan, quote, identified Oswald as person in the lineup who was closest to the man in the window, but he said he was unable to make a positive identification, close quote. That's report, page 145. But there are many reasons to doubt this, starting with conflicts in Brennan's own testimony. And Ian Briggs made a strong case that Brennan never saw Oswald in a lineup that evening. There are police records placing Oswald in 3 lineups that day and corroborating witness reports of them, but there is no evidence whatever that Brennan attended any of the 3. There is another strong reason to doubt that the source was Brennan. Brennan testified later to the Warrant Commission that he saw his suspect in a window of the Texas School Depository, quote, standing up and leaning against the left windowsill, close quote. Pressed to describe how much of the suspect he saw, Brennan answered, quote, I could see probably his whole body from his hips up, but at the time that he was firing the gun, a possibility from his belt up, close quote. The awkwardness of Brennan's language draws attention to the fundamental problem of the description. It is hard to imagine anyone giving a full height and weight estimate from seeing somebody who was only partially visible in a window. So there are intrinsic grounds for believing the description must have come from another source. And when we see the same description is found in Oswald's FBI and CIA files and nowhere else, there are reasons to suspect the source was from government secret files. We have seen that there was interaction in Dallas between the WHCA and DPD radio channels, thanks to the WHCA portable radio that Lawson had installed in the lead car of the presidential motorcade. This radio, in turn, was in contact by police radio with the pilot car ahead of it, carrying Dallas Police Department Deputy Chief Lumpkin of the 488th Army Intelligence Reserve Unit. At the same time, as noted above, it was in contact with the COG Nerve Center at Mount Weather, Virginia. And Mount Weather had the requisite secret communication to receive information from classified intelligence files without other parts of the government being alerted. Now, permit me at this moment an instructive digression. It is by now well known that Kennedy in 1963 was concerned enough by the threat of far-right treason that he urgently persuaded Hollywood director John Frankenheimer to turn the novel 7 Days in May into a movie. And in this movie, to quote Wikipedia, a charismatic superior officer, Air Force General James Mattoon Scott, intends to stage a coup d'etat. According to the plan, an undisclosed Army combat unit known as ECOMCOM will seize control of the country's telephone, radio, and television networks, while the conspiracy directs the military and its allies and Congress and media from Mount Thunder, which Wikipedia explains is a continuity of government base based on Mount Weather, end of quote. It is no secret also that in 1963, Kennedy had aroused major right-wing dissatisfaction, largely because of signs of his increasing rapprochement with the Soviet Union. The plot of the book and movie reflects the concern of liberals at the time about generals like General Edwin Walker, who had resigned in 1961 after Kennedy criticized his political activities in the Army. Walker had given his troops John Birch Society literature along with the names of right-wing candidates to vote for. We can assume, however, that Kennedy had no firm evidence of a Mount Weather conspiracy. If he had, it is unlikely his response would have been to sponsor fictional movie. Now, it's important at this stage to point out that although COG elements like Mount Weather were considered part of the Pentagon, the COG Planning Committee was at no time under military control. On the contrary, President Eisenhower had ensured that it would be broadly based at the top, so its planners included some of the nation's top corporate leaders like Frank Stanton of CBS. By all accounts of COD leadership in the decades after Reagan took office in 1981, this so-called shadow government still included CEOs of private corporations like Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, as well as 3 former CIA directors, Richard Helms, James Schlesinger, and George Bush. Alfonso Ciardi wrote in 1987 that this virtual parallel government empowering North to run Iran-Contra had also developed a secret contingency plan that called for suspension of the Constitution, turning control of the United States over to FEMA. Subsequently, North was questioned in the Iran-Contra hearings about this charge, but he was prevented by the committee chairman, Democratic Senator Inouye, from answering in a public session. Later, investigating the powerful COG planning group, CNN called it, quote, a hidden government in the CUSA about which you know nothing, close quote. James Mann emphasized its hawkish continuity, unaffected by changes of presidency in the White House. And this is from a quote from Mann. Cheney and Rumsfeld were in a sense of the security apparatus of the United States, inhabitants of a world in which presidents come and go, but America always keeps on fighting, close quote. Going one step further, Andrew Coburn quoted a Pentagon source to support a claim that a COG planning group under Clinton was now for the first time staffed, quote, almost exclusively with Republican hawks, close quote. In the words of his source, quote, you could say this was a secret government in waiting. The Clinton administration was extraordinarily inattentive. They had no idea what was going on, close quote. Slightly exaggerated, but nonetheless significant. Now, the Pentagon official's description of COG planners as a, quote, secret government in waiting, close quote, under Clinton, which still included both Cheney and Rumsfeld, is very close to the standard definition of a cabal as a group of persons secretly invited to bring about a change or overthrow of government. A very similar situation existed under Jimmy Carter, when some of those who would later figure in Iran-Contra, such as George Bush and Theodore Shackley, worked with chiefs of foreign intelligence services, the so-called Safari Club, quote, to start working with former DCI Richard Helms, then U.S. ambassador to Iran, and his most trusted operatives outside congressional and agency purview, close quote. This group began by backing guerrilla forces in Africa, notably UNITA of Jonas in Angola, which they knew would not be backed by the CIA under William Colby or Stansfield Turner, Those, by the way, are the two CIA chiefs who were not part of the COG planning commission. But some of these figures, notably Alexandre de Marange of the French spy agency STEC, became involved with Casey, Bush, Shackley, and others in a 1980 plot, the so-called Republican October Surprise, to prevent the re-election of Jimmy Carter. The essence of this plot was to frustrate Carter's efforts to repatriate the hostages seized at the U.S. Tehran embassy by negotiating a Republican deal with the Iranians that would be more to their liking and involved the delivery of arms. The hostages, in fact, were returned hours after Reagan took office in 1981. This Republican hostage plot in 1980 deserves to be counted as a fifth structural deep event in U.S. history. Unquestionably, the context Iran established by the October Surprise Group 1980 became, as Alfonso charted, the, quote, genesis, close quote, of the Iran-Contra arms deals overseen by the COG Mount Weather planners in 1984, 1986. Now, in an important interview with journalist Robert Harry, the veteran CIA officer Miles Copeland claimed, in his words, that a CIA within the CIA inspired the 1980 plot, having concluded by 1980 that Jimmy Carter, again in his words, had to be removed from the presidency for the good of the country, close quote. Copeland made it clear to Parry that he shared this view that Carter, quote, represented a grave threat to the nation, close quote. And former Mossad agent Ari Ben-Panache told Parry that Copeland himself was in fact the conceptual father of the 1980 arms hostages deal and had brokered the Republican cooperation with Israel. And together with his client Adnan Khashoggi, who he advised, went on with Shackley to help launch the 1984-85 Iranian arms deals as well. However, just as Cable in 7 Days in may have overestimated the military component in the COG Mount Weather leadership, so Copeland may have dwelt too exclusively on the CIA component behind the October Surprise Group. In 9/11, I suggested that this CIA network overlapped with a so-called Project Alpha, working at the time for David Rockefeller and Chase Manhattan Bank on Iran issues, a group which was chaired by the veteran establishment figure John J. McCloy. I will conclude by again quoting James Mann's dictum that the Mount Weather COG leadership constitutes a, quote, permanent, though hidden, national security apparatus of the United States, a world in which presidents come and go, but America always keeps on fighting, close quote. And to conclude, I would like this audience to investigate whether elements of this enduring leadership, with its ever-changing mix of CIA veterans and civilian leaders, may have constituted, quote, a secret government in waiting, close quote, not just under Clinton in the 1990s, not just under Carter in 1980, but also for Kennedy in November 1963. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Professor. Professor, we've got some scholars in the room. Rex Bradford is here, and Andrew Craig and others are in the room. Can we take a couple of questions?
Yes, go ahead.
Certainly. Who has a question?
Well,
Craig here. Thank you so much for your brilliant overall analysis.
Thank you, Professor, for your brilliant analysis, which is a great end to a news-breaking conference here, some gathering conclusions. One of the themes here has been how to get young people involved. We haven't had a lot of good answers, but based on your cutting-edge experience in academia and elsewhere, let me float that general question, but also a very specific one. Have you had a chance to research the role of Abraham Bolden, the first Secret Service agent of African American background, hired by JFK, and who warned about security lapses and then was, in my view, framed and sent to prison? Do you have any thoughts on that, or whether the MLK killing is a potential deep event that we should be looking at also?
Yes, I think I've even written about Abraham Bolden, and it's pertinent to what I talked here today, because of course I focused on this misbehavior of the Secret Service in Dallas on November 22nd. What happened in Chicago at the beginning of November is very important. I have signed the petition calling to rehabilitation of Bolden, and everybody should sign that petition. I don't know that, you know, I'm 85 years old and I don't call up facts as quickly as I used to, but I think that there was, we came very close to an assassination in Chicago, which was stymied by the president deciding not to go there. And I relate that to other things that happened in Chicago, which was the Secret Service came up, the deputy chief of the service attorney directed that they should investigate the possible involvement of a man whom I know a great deal about, Paulino Sierra Martinez, who was one of the Cuban exile leaders who was working with Bobby Kennedy and with the CIA in 1963, working to regroup militant exiles outside of the United States and to conduct their activities elsewhere. I really don't have time to go into all of it, but the essence of it is that they had not only, I think there was a plot to kill the president in Chicago, that Bolden was accurate in his warnings about it, and that they already, by the way, there's even a record that Lee Harvey Oswald signed in at the Fox and Hounds Motel just outside of Chicago. So they could have used Oswald there too. But they definitely, the Secret Service was going to pin it on this man, Paulino Sierra Martinez. It was false testimony. It was conspiratorially concatenated testimony. You know, there's so much depth to the Kennedy assassination. You mentioned Bolden, I think Chicago, and we could talk for an hour about Chicago in November '63. But yes, there are many people who who suffered. I mean, probably few people suffered as much as Bolden, but because of speaking the truth about what happened on that day. And yes, we need to, as long as people are still alive, to collect and correlate all the information. And my experience is that young people continue to come. That's why I like to speak in person at talks, because it's always so rewarding to see that young people are there, and they usually are.
Well, we have some other questioners here, so maybe we'll take up the MLK matter another time. But
Russ Baker is here, Professor. Russ?
Hi, Peter.
Hi, Russ.
So I wanted to ask you, because we've had some trouble with Skype, and so unfortunately your delivery has been sort of punctuated, and we didn't get all of the words. I would wonder if you could just repeat your last statement, your sort of summation about COG, please. Just sort of your last 3 or 4 paragraphs. That's so
You
important.
want me to reread it or say it in my own words?
You could just say it in your own words. That's fine.
Yeah, well, what I tried to do in the talk was to suggest that we've had these structural deep events like the Kennedy assassination, Watergate, Iran-Contra, and 9/11, and every time they happen, they're always pinned on some outsider or outside force, whether it's Lee Harvey Oswald or Al-Qaeda. And I said, the first thing I said is, if you look at them closely, which is what I've been doing for a decade or more than a decade, ever since Iran-Contra, you see similarities between them. And then what also emerges is that the personnel, to begin with, in all of them, some of the key personnel have connections to the COG planning network. And then in at least 3 of these events, the COG planning network itself is involved in the events. And the most dramatic case being 9/11, when for the first time, COG was actually implemented. It never had been before. But before it was implemented, there were certain key decisions made, and the 9/11 Commission couldn't find the source for these decisions. They had to be in a phone call. There were no records of the phone calls. And it's pretty clear to me, as I said in the Road to 9/11, that they're not available because they were on the COG network, and in a small footnote that most people didn't notice, the 9/11 Commission said they didn't look into the COG aspects of 9/11, which was almost like saying they didn't look into 9/11. And now, in the case of Watergate, I don't see any use of the network, but James McCord was part of COG planning, and John Dean had overseen COG planning when he was Deputy Attorney General. So the personnel are involved there. And then when it comes to Dallas, as I say, the WHCA channel was the one that was being used by the Secret Service in Dealey Plaza. Its records should have been made available. The WHCA boasts that it helped document what happened, the events of the assassination, but that documentation was never given to the Warren Commission or to the HSCA or to the ARRB. Is that enough of a summary? Or
Yes.
based on that?
Well done, Professor. Professor, it's Alan Dale speaking. When we spoke most recently at length last year, you talked to me about an article that you were preparing, which traced back to, of all people, J. Edgar Hoover and his development of an independent intelligence capability within the FBI back in the 30s. And I'm curious, and I'm not clear in my own thinking, is that a point of origin at which we might trace back to the beginnings of differentiating between a deep state and a public state during the 20th century?
You know, I'm having trouble hearing you as well as you're
I'm
having
so
trouble
sorry.
hearing me.
Right.
But I think you're referring to an article I was writing about J. Edgar Hoover.
Right.
It was published on the Japan Focus website, but more importantly, that's the core of my forthcoming book, The American Deep State, which